Although the Korean Academy of Science and Technology has been established only 23 years ago, CAST has played an integrated role on the global stage along with the prestigious international academies with a long history. In addition, CAST serves for permanent office as the president of the Association of Academies and the Society of Science in Asia, ASA, and also holds its secretariat at this moment. Based on their effort, CAST will hold an international conference of International Human Rights Network of Academies and Scholarly Societies in 2018, next year, and the General Assembly of the Inter-Academy Partnership for Science, IAP, in 2019, but in Seoul. The Nobel Prize Dialogue is an open event for the public, aiming to stimulate the dialogue between the scientific community and Nobel laureate and the rest of the society about the various issues which are emerging from all over the world. Today at this event, we are looking forward to seeking solutions about the main theme, the age to come, from the integrated approach through the Nobel Prize Dialogue. I strongly believe that Korea will have the honor of winning the Nobel Prize in the maybe nearest future. Nobel Prize Dialogue Seoul 2017 can facilitate all of you, not only for more recognition about the Nobel Prize, but also for the greater interest in science and technology. As I mentioned earlier, the theme of Nobel Prize Dialogue is the age to come. And as you might be aware, Korea is aging faster than any other country in the world. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you for your participation and hope you have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity until the end of today's event. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to replace my opening address by raising to you one question that you might be able to answer at the end of today's event. The fundamental question is, do you think that we can meet 100 years of life expectancy? Please try to enjoy yourself. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good morning, everybody. So, as Celine says, I'm Adam Smith, and it's my great honor to be your guide to today's Nobel Prize Dialogue. As you'll see, we have an extremely full program with a lot to get through. So my other role, apart from being your guide, will be to be your timekeeper. Wish me luck. In the session, I'm very pleased to welcome Sarah Harper, who is a professor from the University of Oxford, who's going to give a short introductory talk, and then we're going to move into another panel discussion. So please join me in welcoming Sarah Harper.
It's the total fertility rate across the globe. Because, of course, population aging is actually driven more by falling fertility or falling childbearing than it is about falling mortality. And if you look at this map here, which shows the childbearing, and concentrate on the yellow and the brown, that's 2/3 of the world's countries where childbearing rates are now at replacement, which is just above 2 per couple. And in fact, it's only sub-Saharan Africa, which you can see is dictated by the red, where we have between 4 and 8 children on average. And if we take this map, which is UN median projections for 2050, then you can very clearly see how that is mirroring the fertility one. And if you look at the green, the blue, and the red, those are the countries where over 1/3, over 1/4, and over 20% of the population are going to be aged over 60 by 2050. In fact, the statistics, I think, are even more dramatic when you consider that within 10 years, half of Europe will be aged over 50. We've never had a region of the world where half the population is aged over 50, and the kind of transformation in our institutions that need to occur to cope with that. But even more, by 2040, there will be more older adults in the world than younger adults, more people aged over 65 than under 15 for the first time. But my talk is going to concentrate on the other side, which is falling mortality. And I'm going to give you 3 questions and 3 implications. And the first one is going to build on that fantastic talk we just had from Professor Rabin. Will increases in life expectancy continue? In other words, will there be an increase in the average years lived by humans? If you look at this first diagram, this is life expectancy in selected OECD countries from birth. The red line, the bold lines are for women, the dotted lines are for men, and you can see at the top, the red line, Japanese women, the blue line, French women, the oldest life expectancies, or the longest life expectancies in the world at the moment at about 88, and then quite a dramatic drop down to UK women and US women. Why there is this difference between British and French women is still something that we're considering. But also, look at the way that the line isn't straight. It actually has undulations, and that's important, and I'll come back to that. But of course, we know, as we heard earlier this morning, that one of the biggest reductions in mortality is now occurring over age 65. We never thought that mortality would fall dramatically after 65. Across the life course, yes, but mortality rates after 65, we thought would always increase. We now know that that is wrong, and this, I think, shows it very nicely. Just look at the shapes. This is the contributions of mortality decline in 3 age groups. The green are the under 30s, the brown are 30 to 64, but overwhelmingly, the biggest contribution in a variety of countries comes from the blue, which is the over 65s. And we can see that reflected. These are life expectancies at age 65. In fact, the gap between the French and the Japanese and the UK and the US increases, and 85. Again, huge variations in the trend because of the small numbers we find at that age group. What about going forward? What about projections going forward? I'm going to give you 2 examples, 2 different data sets, 2 different types of modeling, but coming up with very similar results. This is female life expectancy at birth in 2030 using WHO data. And if we look at the top 10, by 2030, the top country in terms of female life expectancy is South Korea. It is predicted with an over 50% probability that South Korea will reach age 90 at birth for life expectancy for women. That was another myth. We would never go through the age 90 life expectancy at birth, but it looks as if Korea within just over 10 years is going to do that. So the final big question is, will advances in life expectancy be matched by advances in healthy life expectancy? And I'm going to just raise one issue, and that is a question that we know, and we've heard it this morning, that one of the reasons why life expectancy and healthy life expectancy are improving are to do with things like public health and food, as well as to do with science. And what is very clear is that although we tackled many of the problems that were associated with things like smoking in the 20th century and really brought down our increased our life expectancy, it's not clear what is going to happen with this scourge of the 21st century, obesity. The really big debate is whether obesity will reduce life expectancy or it will just reduce healthy life expectancy. And this article in 2004 made a very strong claim that American life expectancy would go down due to obesity. We now actually know that it's probably a very different question, because what is becoming very clear is that we are having increasing numbers of people who are living with the chronic disease and comorbidities which come from obesity. And just to give you an example of one study, this is a large study from the Netherlands, where they compared increases in disability and disabled years and life expectancy by the drivers of obesity, alcohol, and smoking. Smoking and alcohol, on average, added round about 3 to 4 years of disability, but also 3 to 4 years of reduced life expectancy, but also 3 to 4 years of increased disabled years. Obesity, however, in this study only reduced life expectancy by 1.4 years, but it increased disabled years by 6. So the implications of this, whether it's going to be life expectancy or healthy life expectancy, are huge for the aging of our population. And I want to look at 3 implications to end with. If we are going to have large numbers of long-lived, frail, disabled people, it isn't just pensions, it isn't just long-term care. It is also going to tackle the fundamental way that our societies are organized. This represents the generational contract. That is a contract that most societies have, and it says very simply, when you're an adult, you have a child dependent, you care for that dependent. When they grow up, they become adults and they care for older dependents. In traditional societies, we do it within families and households. In modern societies, we do it via public services and taxation. Many people are now arguing that we need an adapted generational contract, not only in Europe and the United States, but also we have researchers at Oxford that are working with colleagues here in Asia to look at this. And this says that surely those long-lived generations that have also been successful in reducing not only their mortality rates, but their fertility rates, should bear some responsibility for caring for themselves in later life. But what if we are successful? What if we really can push back healthy life expectancy so that we all live these wonderful, long, healthy lives until we're about 100? It doesn't matter whether you are 60 or 80 if you are active, productive, able to be in the workforce, except for this, generational succession. And already we are seeing in several societies and many governments becoming aware of the change in our generational succession. Generational succession is the way in which we pass down within all societies assets and power and status down through the generations in a very regular pattern. What happens when you do not inherit from your parents until you are 80, or from your grandparents until you are 80? How do we reform our workplaces, our politics, our communities to cope with these very, very long lives? What about these lives themselves? This is a model, a sculpture of Shakespeare's 7 Ages of Man. Are we still going to have 7 ages of man when we're living healthily till 100? Are we going to have 12 ages? Or are we going to change our life courses completely and move to a far more fluid life course, where we mix work and education and leisure or retirement? In European societies, and increasingly, I think, in these societies, we're saying to young people, stay in education until you're in your 20s. You can retire in your 50s, or you're going to live to 100. 30 years productivity in a 100-year lifespan. So I think we are talking about changing the life course in order to adapt to the aging of our societies. But basically, I think the fundamental challenge that we have is that we live in a society which is still very much run by 20th century institutions trying to tackle 21st century problems. And the aging challenge is very much going to dominate the 21st century. This actually is Oxford, which is slightly older than the 20th century, but thank you very much.
And now Anna D'Adio, who is a senior policy analyst at UNESCO, is going to talk about possible changes in education and employment life courses. So, please welcome Anna D'Adio.
Just to briefly give you some of the context and to wrap up what we have heard already this morning. Many countries live in a kind of post-crisis, still post-crisis environment where economic growth is rather low and unemployment is high. At the same time, and this is the topic, the age to come, we face a rapid population aging that is determined by increases in life expectancy and decline in fertility rates, as we already heard. And if we think about the government in this context, it has been a hard moment for them, a hard job trying to strike a balance between financial sustainability of pension system and retirement income adequacy. Why? Because because of declining fertility in many countries, the proportion of people aged 15 to 64 relative to 65 and plus is declining, meaning that in terms of pension system, the number of contributors is declining. At the same time, however, age-related expenditure, public expenditure, is increasing. And we heard population aging will accelerate in almost every country, and including those that are least developed or low-income countries. And this is the measure that may be criticized, and indeed, economists are working on different measures that include different age range. But if we look at the number of people aged 65 plus, for 100 people aged 20 and 64, this will increase everywhere. On average, in the OECD, for example, we will move from around 30 now to almost 60. So this is a number that almost double in the year to come. So my talk will be really looking at how the government, in principle, have tried to address the issue of population aging. And the solution that is proposed by many is that effectively longer working lives may help, because it increases the GDP, it increases tax revenues by enlarging the contribution base, and may make welfare system more sustainable. At the same time, for those that can, and I highlight this, for those that can and want to work longer, this may make their income more sustainable. And this goes to the part of the talk where I would look at the effect of education, employment over the life course on the living standards in old age. So what we mean about living standards? Economists mean different things with living standards. If we look at this chart, healthy life expectancy at age 50 is one thing that is different from the life expectancy that most people commonly refer to. And in fact, people are also different because their employment rates varies across socioeconomic status, demographics, and education level. And we know, for example, that those that have the lowest education level are those that are less likely to work over the lifetime. Also, longevity depends on the level of education. And this is show, for example, that longevity gaps by comparing people with high and low education level at different ages are very large. For example, among men, the longevity gaps in the OECD 23 countries on average is 8 years at age 25. So this means that longevity gaps by education level are even larger in younger generation. And then there is the health, the problems. Many people report health problems, especially older people. And there are some job-related characteristics that affect the probability of working longer. So these are the fact of carrying heavy loads, doing repetitive movements with arms, using technologies, which may affect the work at older ages. But we also heard about the possibility of being trained and skill development. And older people are much less likely, with respect to young people, to be trained. And finally, all these characteristics and the fact that there are differences among genders' experience over the lifetime shape different employment profiles for men and women over the life course. Women are used to work less, often not by choice. They tend to have more atypical careers, to work more often in part-time jobs, and also when they have children, they tend to work less, both when they have a larger number of children and when they have younger children. And another problem that is important for the retirement income adequacy is that gender pay gaps are large in many OECD countries, and these affect retirement incomes in many ways. And in fact, gender pension gaps are very large. If the gender pay gaps are on average around 14–16% in OECD countries, in the chart you see here, you see that gender pay gaps are even larger, 27%. So what is important? It's important to say that there are differences across people, and in addition, there are differences across generations that are building up. And in fact, intergenerational gaps are increasing, poverty risks are shifting onto the young, unemployment is very high, careers are much less fragmented and precarious as they were in the past, and if employment rates of the old people have increased, they have often declined for young people, and the differences persist. It has already said, but I think it's important to say it again, that prevention is much better than cure, and a wide range of policy over the life course may allow to narrow inequality and its effect on pension. And education is really vital. Education is vital because it affects health behavior, it affects employment, incomes, and the way people live then in old age. Bringing young people into the labor market should be a primary concern, and this means giving them skills for work and skills for life, and supporting life learning and skill development is really a priority, and this is also supported by the Sustainable Development Global Goal Agenda, and especially SDG 4 about the education, the global education goal. And it needs to consider also that it's important to prevent that parents stay too much out of the labor market, to be completely detached from the labor market. And it's necessary also to help to cut the length of unemployment. So just to conclude, I will leave it with some questions. What are the strengths and weaknesses of education system that may help also to have a more equitable aging society? So who is accountable for the education or unfinished education agenda? How to improve the design of current pension system in a way to make them more suited to the modern life course realities? And another question is, does redistribution happen at the right stage of the life courses, or we need to think really better at this issue? And I think that complete responses, and today is an important day for this, may eventually contribute to more balanced, equitable aging. Thanks a lot.
Coming up to the last keynote of the morning. Now, let's just have a show of hands. Who is feeling encouraged about the prospect of increased longevity, and who is feeling discouraged at this point? Hands up if you feel encouraged. Good. How about if you feel discouraged? Everybody's feeling encouraged. That's great. Somehow we've sent a positive message. Well, anyway, that positive message continues now, because we're going to have a talk from Ursula Staudinger, who you've already met as moderator of a panel, and she's going to speak about the positive plasticity of human aging. So, Ursula, please.
Now, let me focus in the remainder of my talk on empirical evidence for the modifiability of cognition, because we heard again and again that this is one of the daunting fears that is with us and with aging societies, that we may all end up demented. When we study cognitive aging, there's one important dimension of cognitive aging. It's called the mechanics of the mind, which has to do with the number of neurons, their connectivity, and the speed with which new information is transported through the brain. And it is measured on a behavioral level by the speed of information processing for new information. And what you see depicted here is a typical lifespan curve from the 20s into the 90s and the 100s of the speed with which a person can react to a new information. You see the yellow dots, these are individuals, and you see a very pessimistic story. Because after age 25, we all go downhill. I'm not asking now who is not yet 25. Now let's take a closer look. There are three major modifiers of this trajectory that may actually present the possibility to move this curve around. The first one is the decline in the trajectory may start later than depicted in this longitudinal graph, which was around age 25. We now have evidence that it actually has been moved to the right roughly by 10 years, so that it is rather in the early 30s than in the early 20s, which actually made a major difference at the end of life, as you can imagine. The second mechanism is that not only the turning point is moved over, but the mean level of the curve is shifted. Again, major impact. If this mean curve is shifted up, major impact, even if the shape stays the same. So what can I tell you about that? Here is evidence from the Berlin Aging Study, which has studied the 70-year-old plus. In the first longitudinal start was in 1994, and the second cohort was studied in 2014. And now these two cohorts, which are 20 years apart, have been studied with regard to their cognitive functioning, here measured with the digit symbol test. And what you can see is on the two bars, the gridded bar and the solid filled bar, is the positive improvement, so the increase in average level of functioning in 20 years apart cohorts of 70-year plus population. And this is all statistically matched for other differences. So it has been done as you could do it in terms of statistical controls. So the same chronological age, 70 plus, implies a different cognitive age at different historical times. This also has implications for pathology. This is now quite revolutionary evidence that has been collected across 10 countries. You see the citations on the left. And it really talks about the prevalence of Alzheimer dementia in 20 years of difference from 1999 to 2011. And depicted here is the example from the UK. And you see the arrows, the red arrow and the blue arrow, highlighting that the prevalence has significantly decreased across these 20 years. No, we don't have a cure yet for Alzheimer's disease or for other dementias, but there seem to be other social-cultural trends, for instance, like the cognitive stimulation that we are exposed to through our working life and in everyday life, that seem to have positive impacts on when the threshold to the diagnosis is hit. Now, we have taken that evidence in one study and asked the question, what does it mean? If there is this cognitive plasticity, what does it mean on a country level? So if we project the average cognitive level in the population 50 plus in the UK under the conditions that the UK will be older in the future than it is now, what does that mean for the UK in the future? Will the UK in the future will be actually dumber because it has an older population? What is the consequence? We have observed longitudinally across 6 years from 2002 to 2008, and if we would not assume that there's an improvement from cohort to cohort, this is the decline that we would observe in the UK from 2002 to 2042. However, if we bring in the cohort improvements, then we would need to observe an improvement across 5 years for men of 0.04 in cognitive performance, in this case, the number of words remembered, and for women of 0.03. What did we actually observe across 5 years? We observed the fourfold for men, 0.16, and for women, the sixfold, 1.8. So what this means is that the UK in the year 2042 will not only not be dumber, even though it will be older, but it will actually be more cognitively apt, more intelligent in the year 2042, even though it has an aged population. Why is that possible? Because of the cohort improvements in cognitive functioning, the rising of the mean levels that I talked about. We have done a longitudinal study in the 60+ on cognitive mechanics that I showed you before, and one group did aerobic training, one group did gymnastics, and one group did relaxation. And we tested their fitness levels at 3 points in time. And what we find is already after 6 months that the ones that were trained with the Nordic walking, the aerobic training, made major improvements in their speed of information processing. But that is not enough. When we look into the brains and we test in the prefrontal areas where there's the strongest biologically based age-related decline to find that the ones that had improved so much in the aerobic group also showed a reduction in the necessary activity in the relevant brain areas to come up with that performance. So they were better in their performance with less effort in the brain. And we know from the animal model that there are multiple physiological mechanisms underlying this: increased blood flow, increased muscle activity, which leads to growth hormone emission from the muscle, which travels into the brain, which helps with neurogenesis. And most recently, actually a colleague of mine at Columbia University, Gerard-Cassenti, has been finding that bone activity is also having endocrinological effects that help with brain functioning and help to improve the cognitive functioning. So this is not a spurious correlation. This has a very good physiological basis. Now, I would argue that the evidence that I showed you is, yes, we can move this curve around, we can move it up, we can move it to the side, and it is possible to influence the slope, but this will not happen by itself. It is requiring major efforts on the societal part as well as individual parts. And so I would like to make my last claim that we need to implement cognitive training in vivo by implementing new lifetime structures that are constructed such that in these longer lives we have continuous challenges for our brain in order to avoid to lose it. And it needs to be built into our work environments, in our living environments, so that it is easier for people to actually keep up with it. It's not an individual decision, but it's just a natural thing that comes to us. And I just show you one piece of evidence how easy this is possible. This is an assembly line worker study where we were interested in the most routine jobs that actually kill the brain because it's the same thing day after day after day. Is it possible that we can find differences in the cognitive aging based on one feature only? And that is the work task changes that these assembly line workers experienced across 16 years. So we had assembly line workers full-time for 16 years, and one part had few changes, 0 or 1, and the other part, which was statistically matched, had 4 or more task changes. No further training, just different tasks. And what do we find? You look at the dark bars, the workers who had more changes had better performance, the number of correct trials in a shorter amount of time. And when we look into the brain of these workers with the more task changes, we see that the areas that are associated with learning and attention actually were bigger. These were structural analyses. They were bigger, significantly bigger than in their fellow workers who had fewer changes. So it's very simple changes in everyday environments that actually can make a major difference to how our brain changes. So are we capable of making use of longer lives? Yes, but it requires investment, it requires health promotion and sickness prevention across the different classes. We need education across the lifespan and for everyone, not only for the ones who go to college. We need more versatile work biographies that I just illustrated for you. And we need to look at other sources of productivity, such as volunteering, for instance. And then I think we need to bring in the new economy of longer lives, which is opening up actually completely new markets that can be growing in a society of longer lives. Thank you very much for your attention.
So, on stage with me, I have Robert Huber from the Technical University of Munich, who is one of the 1988 Nobel laureates in chemistry for his work unraveling the structure of the photosynthetic reaction center, and also Ada Yonat from the Weizmann Institute in Israel, who is 2009 Nobel laureate in chemistry for her work, which revealed the structure of the ribosome. And both those discoveries were landmark research in X-ray crystallography. And they were part of this great chain of advances in imaging research that has stretched all the way from the 1901 prize for the discovery of X-rays to Wilhelm Röntgen, the first ever Nobel Prize, to now, to this year, in fact, where we've just had a Nobel Prize in chemistry awarded for the development of cryo-electron microscopy. So, Robert, and we thought we'd take advantage of the fact that we have two people who are part of that chain to have a brief discussion about the role of imaging research and what it might reveal about the molecular mechanisms of life. Yes. And where has this forefront got to as we can delve deeper and deeper into life's processes? What are we now able to see at this point?
Well, what we see is molecules that are responsible for certain diseases if they do not function properly in atomic detail. And then with that knowledge, we can use we can use that in order to design and make molecules that interfere with their activity and modulate them and actually have drugs that are therefore life-saving in cardiovascular diseases, in diabetes, in even neurodegenerative diseases. So we are at that stage where we can design and make life-saving drugs.
Ada, I know you're particularly interested in the development of new antibiotics. Are we able to image enough to be able to work out how to make the new antibiotics?
Maybe I can talk a little bit about imaging more than antibiotics.
Yes, of course. Please.
What causes changes of life, and now we are interested in aging, are processes. Processes that molecules, particles, parts of cells are involved in. And with the latest revolution that we got with imaging, we can look at different states of operation within the cell, or at least when we take the particles out of the cell, what can they do or what cannot they do, and sometimes how can we understand it in order to control it, which is not only antibiotics, but not only medicine, but also understanding the process itself. And I have lots of hopes about that in order to have a better look into what really happens in cells, in cells that we know they will age. We will age with our cells. So this is the aging process, which so far we could see components of it, as Robert just talked about. Now we may be able to see how the things are evolving towards aging. So this is my big hope about what imaging can do to understand aging and to find ways, I don't want to say fight with it, but accommodate it or get the best out of it.
And year after year, we're exposed to new discoveries which allow us to see something in more detail. Is that just going to continue? Are we going to get more and more and more detailed as this next century of vision goes on?
Well, in structural biology, we still follow the rule divide et impera. That is, we isolate the individual components and then determine their structures and their functions and develop modulators, controlling agents. What we would like to do is really to see the players in a living cell. And I think we are already on the way to it, not by X-ray crystallography. For that we need crystals, we need isolated molecules. We came very far with that technique, also analyzing huge protein complexes. But with the newly developed cryo-electron microscopy field that was just honored with the chemistry Nobel Prize in the last months, we can approach a stage where we can see inside living cells and analyze the individual components. That is the future development, but it is not a too distant future, I would guess.
Professor Rita Levi-Monticelli died 5 years ago at the age of 103. She was the oldest Nobel Prize winner that was alive. She got it for her work on nerve growth factor. I didn't know her personally, but when I got the prize, she was over 100 years old, and she called me on the phone. She got it, she congratulated me. That's the way to be old. Then I met one of her postdocs, previous postdocs, and he told me that he asked her a question. He called her and asked her a question about the age of 100. And she told him, why don't you come to the lecture that I'm going to give in 2 weeks, and I will answer your questions. This is the way to become old, happy, and with brain.
That's a perfect point to stop this first half of the morning, talking of a supercentenarian.